Welcome to the Consummate Athlete podcast, where we explore what it means to be a well-rounded, happy, goal-crushing athlete. Every week, myself, sports journalist Molly Herford, and cycling coach and kinesiologist Peter Glassford interview experts and chat through all of your training questions. We're excited to have you along for the ride. Hello. Welcome back to the Consummate Athlete podcast. Peter, how's it going?
It's going excellent. How are you feeling? You were just out on a mountain bike ride, and it might have, I don't know, I said the first one in a year, but I don't know if it had been that long.
Hadn't been that long, but definitely half a year. I mean, to be fair, it's been fall, winter. It's not like the mountain biking
You
has
run
been.
a lot. You've done other bike rides, but it's been a while. And these were real mountain bike trails too.
They were.
You did
Yes.
great. You did great.
Thank you.
Now, are you able to walk today?
I'm actually okay today. Although, you know what? The fact that it's Monday and it's a rest day, I'm not gonna lie, I'm psyched about that. But it was really fun. It's always that, honestly, the level of dread going into
Well, you were
anytime
riding
I do
with three
national champions.
Masters national champions. So
This is true.
there
This is
you go.
true.
There you go.
And you know what? We'll cast a veil over the age categories. But suffice to say, I was the slow man. And that was okay. But no, I mean, honestly, just the level of stress and dread I felt before the ride, just anytime you're riding with new people, these are new friends of ours that we met down here in Brevard. But anytime you're riding with new people and you haven't been riding for a while, there is like a huge, I don't think it matters how good you are. Okay, maybe like a pro tour rider doesn't have this, but I think most of us, even no matter how fit you are, when you're riding with new people, there is a stress about just like, how is this going to go? Am I going to be slow? Are these trails, especially with mountain biking, are these trails going to be really technical? Like I can muscle my way up climbs. I can, ride for,
Sure.
Days, no problem. But the second the trails get super technical, like I'm going to be in trouble. So
And I do think this is, as much as you and I are okay, moving on our own, I do think it's a good reason if you are going to do events, which we do think you should do events of some type, race or fondo or tour or whatever. We do think this is good. But I think this is also an argument to train with other people, exercise, move, adventure with other people, because those nerves then come out, especially if you are going to be racing in something. I think that social dynamic is something that, is going to hamper someone's race performance if they're not used to some of these social comparisons and so forth. I don't know that you ever lose them.
For sure.
But you get better at just sort of saying it'll be okay.
You know what? I'm so proud of us. We also went to Run Club on Wednesday. Our friend down here, Steve, who we randomly ran into in the forest. I'm going to be clear. He noticed DW. He recognized DW before he recognized us. We are not famous. Our tiny dachshund, very famous.
Loud. Yeah.
Or loud. Anyway, he was there. He mentioned that in Pisgah, there's this, run club that meets at 5:30. There was a brewery involved. So naturally we were like, sign us up. We went to that. It was total blast, met some new people. This is all very out of our introverted comfort zone. Man, it's been a month for that, from murder mystery parties with horse people to this. Like we are. Oof.
So there you go. So, I mean, we're talking a lot about the social side of things. I guess here in this kickoff, this intro, if we can call it that, we had two good questions here, which are bigger questions, and more on the nitty gritty of training today. So we'll do our best with that. Was there anything else in the intro you wanted to get done?
Just that, we're getting into the beginning of not quite spring season, but I mean, we are mid-February, late February at this point, which is terrifying to think about, but we are in late February. So really that thinking about, if you are kind of questioning what you're doing for the spring, if you have a spring race coming up, it might be time to, either book a consult to kind of talk through that if you haven't really been doing much and you're just not really sure where to proceed or how to proceed. Or if it is a specific event and you're thinking, okay, it's, between 8 and 16 weeks away, say it might be time to think about that 3-month custom plan to get you to that race start feeling your best and ready to perform at your best.
Sure.
So you can find those over at consummateathlete.com, or we'll just throw links into the show notes for that. Yeah, I think tis the season, right? Like early January is always pretty hectic for that stuff, but then I think this time of year also it starts picking up because now everyone's realizing, oh crap, racing is not as far away as we thought, right? Like,
Well, and maybe you're getting, the weather improves. I always joke that there's the people who think you only train indoors because you can't possibly train outdoors. And then there's the folks who wait for the training outdoors so that they can train outdoors because you can't possibly train when it's crummy outside.
right.
So there's probably a middle ground there somewhere. So I think those folks who are waiting for the better weather and they can, get outside a little bit, that's sort of coming depending on where you are.
Well, and I mean, this is I wrote this article back in November of 2021, where it was like the kind of joking, but also very serious that like in November, Unbound is not as far away as you think it is, and by the end of February, those early June races, especially the really long ones, like they are coming fast. So
Okay.
yeah, definitely, if you have a spring or summer goal, let's chat about it. And I mean, that kind of leads into this first question.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah.
I have it pulled up.
Okay.
With our current setup, the computer is further away. So here we go. I got my phone here and we're going to read this. So, would you recommend any sort of testing as we get into the most intense blocks of training to make sure my zones and numbers all line up? I know there's testing centers in the town. These people do lactate threshold and VO2 max testing. Would you recommend completing these tests to complement your programming?
Ooh, okay.
I guess that's my programming, but
yeah. So this is basically, how do you feel about test don't guess, which is a saying that I feel like has really been going around the cycling sphere lately. And I mean really any fitness sphere, right? Like this came up when Whoop started coming out. This came up when, like any of the
Even
wearables
the blood
really.
testing too has some sort of variation on that.
For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
Like, yeah, I mean, whether you're talking about
What is it? The
actual,
proof is in the blood or something?
yeah,
Yeah.
even like CGMs where you're testing blood glucose, all that kind of stuff. So I do think this has been around for a while, but as testing gets more and more ubiquitous, less and less expensive. I mean, let's be clear, it's still expensive, but it's no longer where you need, a hospital setting basically in order to do a lot of this stuff.
So we did do this. I'll link to the past episode if you want to see what we said years ago. I don't think we'll be a ton different. Hopefully, we'll add a little bit of nuance in some of the wearable, as you say. There are some new options in the spectrum of what could be called testing. But I'll link to that. So I do think this is an interesting question. It's something that there's probably a few things we should say right off the bat as far as, there's few people we know who do make their livelihood even testing people, in quote unquote lab testing or trainer testing or indoor testing or whatever you want to call this. So I think it's all good. So as with most things, if you want to spend your money, spend your money. If you like it, if you've been doing it, if you believe in it, I think continue doing it. So any of the, if we call them criticisms or downsides or, alternatives we talk about today are just that. I think lab testing, as it were, we'll get into the definitions here in a second, is great, but I think just that caveat going into this, that we're not disparaging anyone, hopefully, with our view or stand on this.
Okay, love it.
And then,
now on to the disparaging.
well, there you go. So we should probably say, so that when we talk about testing for, cycling or running, it's basically the same endurance sport, especially, there's sort of this spectrum of what you might call field testing, up to lab testing. And lab is sort of a loose term, but at the far end of that spectrum would be, you're in a university usually or a professional lab of some type, and someone who has probably got a lot of letters and designations beside their name is taking you through a test that they've probably executed and studied many times in their life. And that's a big portion of their life is, as a physiologist, studying and executing these highly, calibrated and expensive to run tests on very big and expensive machines that are, well calibrated and in like the most, clean environment possible. That would be at the far end of what lab testing is. Like imagine a lab from a cartoon, and that's what we're talking about. And then on the far other end would be, you at home or out on your road bike doing a time trial, right? The classic 40K TT would be a form of testing.
Right.
Maybe even on the other side of that, moving would be like Strava, going for the segment would be a form of testing. So there's all these different things you can do. The runners do their 5K or 10K time trial, and it's not exact, right? It's a pace, there's wind, there's the shoes, there's all sorts of variables that could play into that. So as you get into field testing, there's that spectrum of just the variables and how concerned we can get with it are probably increasing as you go into field testing, but it's probably beginning to look more like your sport, where if you're a road cyclist or a runner and you do a 5K TT, the 5K TT might actually be your event. So when we get into predictive value, you start getting this argument between, yes, there are some variables, but that is also the sport you're doing. So it's not that one is worse than the other. It's just the lab test is probably looking at one or two specific pieces of, VO2 max, lactate threshold. They're measuring a specific thing, whereas the field test is measuring that whole messy thing that you do in the field.
Right.
Yeah. So there's that spectrum. So that's is testing, I guess, in a, and there's all sorts of things in between there, but that's the
Okay,
idea.
so what are sort of some of the primary tests that a cyclist might do? I guess let's start. FTP test is sort of the most common one. Most of the time you're doing that just at home, as you say, like on the road or on the
It
trainer.
could be indoor trainer, it could be on the road. I mean, certainly there's lots of people now are doing on Zwift, and these different systems will have different ramp tests, which is sort of like a VO2 max test. You're just not wearing a mask in most cases. You're just gradually increasing or ramping the wattage, usually in steps. They might call them a step test or a ramp test, where you go, 100 watts for 3, 5, 8 minutes, 125 watts, 150 watts until you fail, or until you get to, say, a threshold or a certain heart rate, right? They don't all go to maximal, collapsing over your handlebars, but some do. And then usually in a lot of those ramp tests, you could be looking for different things. But a lot of them, including the VO2 max, you're sort of looking for this peak minute power output. So it's called a few different things, but I think it's like peak power output is actually what they call it in a VO2 max test. So you get to your VO2 max, which is the max oxygen consumption, and then it's the peak power output for that minute. And then usually they do something with that.
Okay, but you've skipped to VO2.
Sorry, where was I?
I was asking about FTP, which is
Oh,
the most common
okay.
of the.
Yeah. So that's just, usually people will do 20 or 30 or 60 minutes of steady state, or quasi steady state is, I think, what the definition says, to try and determine this power output that you can hold for an extended period of time.
And most of the time your power curve, so like what your power zones are determined by FTP testing. Like that's just sort of how most coaches are going about doing this.
Pretty much, yeah. If you're doing power, yeah, that's pretty much what you have in the field, right? You don't really have that peak power output, so you could determine it based off of that. They also call that maximal aerobic power. If you had a VO2 max test, you could take that minute and do something with it. But the threshold, you're always using a percentage of that test, or the functional threshold power, similar to what you might do with like a lactate threshold test. But yeah, that's the idea, is you set your power zones off of that.
Yes. And I was actually interviewing Tim Cusack, who is one of like the longest running cycling coaches in the US. I'd say
and I'm big in Training Peaks and the WKO like analysis software.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I actually asked him about this question, and he said, for most people, FTP really is, that's your primary measure. Like most people, that's what makes sense. It, like, you can, if you add other tests, there might be slight variations to what your power zones are going to be set at, but I have to pull up the quote, but I think he said something to the effect of like 98% of people, FTP, like making your zone set based on your FTP, is going to be pretty accurate.
Right. And this gets to the question here is, if you're, I guess it was sort of implicit in the question I read there is, if you don't do physiological testing or lab testing, are you indeed guessing at your zones? Or you could invert that and say, are you that sure that the lab test that you did is not also, guessing? Or you could say, what is the error margin on that, especially as you start getting further and further away from the day of that test? How sure are you that we're not all guessing no matter what? And then what is the margin of error that's appropriate, right?
Right. And I think there's just so many differences between, being in a lab setting versus at like you said, the farthest out, being on your local hill. Like it's apples to oranges in a lot of ways.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I did a lot of testing, and I'll say with Steve Neal, who's someone, if you can ever go and test with Steve, he's out in Kelowna, and it's not because of necessarily even the testing stuff. He would probably disagree, but the testing's very worthwhile. I don't know, it probably is. But I think it's more working with these people who have been testing for a long time and can give you these nuggets of wisdom and guidance. I think that's actually more what you're paying for if you can go see someone like that. But I would say most people who are offering testing don't have those years of experience and or the designations that make them, a physiologist with a lab. And then where I get into the margin of error problem is a lot of the equipment that's not lab equipment does have pretty big margins of errors in ways that they can get screwed up, especially if you don't know what you're doing. And if the equipment's getting moved around and, it just gets tricky if you're, in a gym and the stuff's, again, not really great equipment. Then this is where I get like, what's the margin of error on this? If they did the test again the next day or a week later, would you get the same results is sort of the question.
Right, which also gets to just the human body. Like anytime we're testing in that moment, in that exact like moment of time. And I think there's always going to be a plus minus of what 10, 20, whatever watts, right? Like if you could, for a woman, like you have PMS that day, you're feeling really flat. Like,
Sure. Or you
yeah,
put a bunch of fatigue into the system,
yeah,
or you eat a little differently. Again, this isn't necessarily even something that lab testing can solve, and it does test the one or two metrics, right? And assuming the test is well done and the person knows what they're doing, you probably get a reasonable measure. But then the question is, you have a VO2 max, and then what are you going to do with that? Which again, the people who do the testing might be able to paint a narrative around this, but this has always been my question with it is, does it actually tell us more about what to do with our training than something we might, take from race results or take from experience or take from just where our training experience, right? Like if you're just starting, the answer is pretty straightforward what you should do.
right. And I think to come back to your first point about the expense of it, again, not saying you shouldn't do it, but just like this is an expense. If you test once, that doesn't really mean anything if you're not going to retest. So your cost is not just one test, right?
No,
Your
I would say you'd
cost.
want to do a lot, right? And again, we did a lot as I was coming up, and I was telling you a story last night that some of the things I remember the most, and I think took the most benefit from, were actually more supervised intervals that weren't, I wouldn't even call testing. Steve was probably taking lactates during this. But it was more, I was with another person. So that gets to the social thing. We started off with like a competitor, a friend, but a competitor in both cases that I'm thinking of. One was actually outdoors.
Much like in women's cycling, where every competitor is your best friend.
Best friend. But then, yeah, and then also having the coach there, sort of like coaching the session. And again, one was indoors on a trainer and one was outdoors, like repeating the same section, but both with another person. And I think that's what sticks out for me is that like the two that I think about are probably one of the few that were with someone else there. Like another athlete also there, which is interesting, right? Because then it's like, could you get a similar benefit just by doing intervals with your friend? Right, where yes, it's nerve wracking, but so is the race, right? And you push harder or whatever. I think it's just there's some good learning there. So where are we going with that?
Okay. Actually, before you go any further with
Okay,
that, I
good.
do want to jump into, can we just briefly talk about just the difference between, I think there's like a little bit of confusion with VO2, where there's what is your VO2 and then what is your VO2 like on the bike power wise. So can you maybe speak to
Oh yeah, so
that?
that's what I was saying with the peak power output or mean or maximal aerobic power. So it's sort of that like peak minute, and I'm not that well versed in this, but that's the idea is that you could maybe take power zones out of even a lactate threshold, like any of these physiological ones, while they're doing the test, they then associate a heart rate and a power usually with those physiological measures. So when the lactate begins to rise exponentially or at 2 millimoles and 4 millimoles or whatever they're doing, they would say, okay, around this power. Usually they don't say exactly at 300 watts. They say plus or minus, this is about your lactate threshold, which sounds a lot like functional threshold power. I'm not saying they're the same because people get really grumpy about thresholds, but that's the idea is that around this, and then we're going to take a percentage off of this. So around 300 watts, because that's about where there was a rise in the lactate, then we're going to build your zones. And these are the zones that apparently you're not guessing at based off of this test, even though it's still a percentage that's being taken off of these.
Okay. Now, what is VO2, like the number that shows up on our Garmin? Just, I think we probably need some of these definitions.
This is one where, Marco Altini, who's the HRV for training guy, a lot of his, he has like well, not seven, but he has two PhDs, I think, and one is around some of these machine learning and estimating physiological values from data. And so he basically what you do is you can do it with power. You just plug in a power value, and then it takes your body weight, and then does a bunch of they have formulas the same way as when you do those scales that estimate your body fat percentage and whatnot. It's not really, it's just sensing sort of like the impedance that's going through your
Right.
thing, and then it's guessing based on a formula. So it's measured. They've measured lots and lots of people, and then they made a formula that sort of seemed to estimate within a certain margin for to be as close as they could. So that's all the watch is doing, is it's saying, okay, you went this fast, or your heart rate was this, and your weight is this, and it's plugging it into a formula based on what the watch or the bike computer knows. And that's what WKO also, the Training Peak software will also say, okay, your threshold value is this, your curve looks like this, so we're guessing at what your VO2 max power in this case, or again, mean maximal aerobic power would be, yeah, based off of these values that it knows.
Okay. And just to kind of keep furthering but what does this mean? What does this mean? With the VO2, if yours says, 55 or 70 or 40, like what is the range, or what is it, like the maximum that it can be versus
Well,
the
and I guess that's
lowest
the
it can
question, right?
be?
So there's some people will say, okay, well, this like determines whether you could go to the pro tour or not. And there's probably a bit of, there's genetic factors. You'll see,
Okay.
I don't know.
What is the range?
Oh, I mean, like it's quote unquote normal person might be 35, or like, 40, 50. Women tend to be maybe 10% lower than men, again, on average. Um, and then they say, the trainability in a textbook, they'd say
What is the high?
oh, sorry. So mine would be like say 70, but if you were in the Tour de France and doing really well, it might be like 80. And I think, the outliers are like 90. And then there was one guy, I don't even remember, he's a young guy, 18. I can't recall his name. He quit the sport, which is often a lesson here. His was almost 100 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram. So this is the relative value. So it's relative to your body weight.
Okay. So in theory, it could be over 100. This is not like a percentage
I don't
scale.
think if you're a horse, yeah. I don't think humans, if again, this is where
It just
I don't think
happens to
so.
be weirdly maxed out at 100, even though it's not a percentage.
Yeah, I don't know. Usually you'll see like 70s and 80s would be most of the like high elite people.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if your number is not high, what does does that mean? Like, A, is it trainable? And B, does it mean that you like can't be elite? Because I'll tell you right now, my Garmin does not estimate mine very high.
What did it say?
Like 53.
Yeah, I don't think that's irregular, but you also don't max out a ton too. So this is where it gets tricky, where some of these watches don't know enough. So if you went,
Well, it is like a new watch.
you'd have to
also.
go and almost run, like a 5 or 10K and really max out, and then it would have a bit more data. And I don't know with running too, right? Like you run on trails a lot of the time too. So it's, if you don't ever wind up a hard like pavement effort, like I don't think it's able to guess necessarily off of, because it doesn't know what soil you're on. And so it's hard for it to know, right? You have to always ask, like, what does the thing know about you? Especially with these wearables. Where were we going there? We had the VO2, the oxygen. So trainability, they say 10 to 15% that you can increase it. There's people that say it's different. I never understand. I think they mean, the absolute value rather than the relative value. So the relative value is the one where it's per kilogram. So it's relative to your body weight. So if you lost weight, not saying that this is, you need to lose weight.
Don't do this.
But if someone was very overweight and their VO2 was what it was and they lost weight, then that relative value is obviously going to increase because the kilograms, the weight changes. So there's also that. So I imagine that's what they mean, but it seems unclear in a lot of the things you read. So yeah, so that's the idea. But I don't think anyone thinks, I think that's really changed, over the last few years, that it isn't like a death sentence if you're 50 and you for some reason need to get to 60. But the other thing to remember with all of this, I think two good examples. Lance Armstrong ran a 3-hour marathon. His VO2 max is like, say, 80. I don't recall what it is, but it's high. So he ran a marathon. He was very fit. He had pacers. He trained, not, a long time, but trained enough. But his VO2 max was 80. So he should have won the marathon.
Right.
But he did, like I did a 3-hour marathon almost the same year, and mine is 70.
Take that, Lance.
So what that means is that, there's obviously you need to train for an extended period of time for endurance sport to do well. And there's obviously specific adaptations that aren't that, right? So they always say that it's not that predictive. You're curious about it in a lot of endurance sports is actually that threshold, whatever type you're doing. And what you'll see often is the people who have very high VO2 max, they actually are less efficient a lot of the time because they don't have to be that efficient because they can use oxygen, they're bringing in so much oxygen.
Right.
Now, the people that are lower, say someone's 70, but they're just in the Tour de France, they could ride at a high percentage of that. So their lactate threshold is a higher percentage, closer to that VO2 max. And that's where you see some variability, and why you might want to know all of these thresholds and these VO2s and things is because that might tell you, how your training's progressing things. So say yours is 50, but maybe you can operate at, 45 or a high percentage of that forever. Right. And then it almost doesn't matter because someone who's, in the women's stuff, maybe there are some 70s but maybe they all run at the same. They run at say 45 because, that's a higher value and they don't have to. Right. They can already move that much oxygen. It's just a lower percentage. So that's sort of, always a thing that you'll see in textbooks is that people with lower was just end up running at a higher percentage. And it's, again, those different thresholds just operate at different places.
Right. Okay. So maybe coming back to the testing here, maybe what are some of the questions you should ask yourself before you book a test?
Yeah. Like are you training? I would say get going. So I mentioned earlier, if you're not doing much, it's pretty obvious what you need to do. And we didn't really finish that, but you need to increase the frequency of your training. And I really I think you could watch the Steven Seiler TED Talk, No Pain, No Gain, and then start training from that. Like the idea is it shouldn't be hard and you should be able to do it a lot. So if it's so hard that you can't do it the next day, this would, strength training, soreness, running, you can't walk the next day. You did too much. So walk more, this type of thing. So starting out, this thing that you need to set your zones to start training is just ridiculous. Like I always think there's probably, for people starting out, there's probably 2 zones. There's like easy, call it under 80% of whatever you want. Just easy. Talk test is commonly used here. And even in any of this, like the Inigo San Milan, who's on Peter Attia podcast. We'll link to this. This is where a lot of the next question as well is coming from this. And he's big on zone 2 training, and lactate and this sort of thing. And so the end result of all of this is probably the talk test is what you want to start using when you're out training, if you can't be taking lactates throughout all of your training.
Yeah. And I did actually interview him about zone 2 a while ago for Bicycling Magazine. Actually, when we were in Leadville, I interviewed him over the summer, and that was exactly what he said. Because I asked, like, what is sort of the testing protocol? How do you know if you're in zone 2? And he's like, well, can you have a conversation? Mm-hmm. There you go.
Yep.
And I mean, it's funny because maybe I'm missing, like, I'm sure at the lower or like shorter end of the spectrum, runners are doing a lot more of these tests, but like certainly
You mean like at the elite level? Is that what you mean?
No, like shorter distances, like 5K, 10K track. But and maybe some marathoners are, but I would say for the most part, even the top marathon runners, definitely the top ultra endurance people, are really rolling off of like easy, easy, moderate, hard. Like that's certainly what I train at, and like seems to work pretty well.
Well, we were talking about you don't really do much even field testing.
No.
And I don't know what David does across the spectrum. That'd be an interesting question next time we have him on to talk a bit towards that. But yeah, it's in some ways, like I've heard a few coaches talk about, if you can't do the training, then you're probably training too hard to, so you need to train easier to accumulate whatever the volume is for that sport, especially in ultra, as you say, like it's this, they call it trial of miles and putting in the volume over time. And so when you start seeing people breaking down, sometimes that's the thing, is that they're training into this middle ground a bit too much. And for some of those athletes, you may need to go get testing so that someone actually tells you, look at, there's a break point here and your lactate's increasing and you keep trying to run at 150 beats. And for some reason you won't run at 140. You need to start doing it, even if it means walking. Like this is what happens. And that's why you're getting sick, or, some people might need to go and see that. And I think that's a great reason to go get testing. If you're not having success in training, right, then I think you probably are the type of person that should go get, see it on a screen and have someone, in a lab coat or who looks like they know what they're talking about tell you, you need to train easier.
Right, which I guess is maybe the second question is like, is training working or are you, wrecked all the time? Have you been plateaued for months?
And we didn't talk about one other type of lab testing that's actually getting more popularity, and this is that metabolic testing. I think this would fit in with that zone 2 or aerobic threshold testing, where you're trying to find sometimes this fat max they'll talk about, the point where you're burning the most amount of fat, right? And when you start up, especially these tests aren't as fast in the ramp. They don't increase as quickly as a traditional VO2 max test that sort of ramps up to difficult quickly. These are more gradual, and what you're looking for is this point where they can measure the amount of carbohydrates you're burning and the amount of fat you're burning, and then there's a crossover point usually where you start burning more carbohydrates than fat because you're going harder. And what you'll see, and what the narrative usually is that there's some people who are sugar burners, and sometimes they'll even like be standing there and they're just burning, more carbs than fat, just barely moving. And so these are, I don't know what you do then, like what's your training zone? I don't know. I guess you walk or you lay there or something. But the idea is that those people would benefit from, trying to increase their fat max. And indeed, most endurance athletes, that's what you're trying to do in zone 2 and 1 and 2, the endurance training zones. You're trying to increase the amount of fat utilization you're doing, right? And the mitochondria, increasing these as well, the density of those. So by testing this, then, you're trying to find that fat burning range, right? Which is, we all see that on the treadmills and all these things, right? That's sort of always been around. So that's the other type of testing a lot of people are doing. And indeed, some cases might make a lot of sense if someone's not, making progress just with, what we want to call standardized zones or, basic zones, power zones off of a threshold or a max heart rate or whatever.
Right. Okay. Well, I think hopefully that I feel like that just might have muddied the waters more for people, but hopefully that helps just at least contextualize testing just a little bit more.
Well, and if you're someone who's gotten testing recently, I do think that the power is on the returning to the next test, the retest, where you've trained successfully for a few weeks, months, probably 6 weeks to 3 months or something between. And then you go back and you test again, and then what changed? And this is, I think, where you can decide for yourself if it was interesting. Was it motivating for you to train better? Did you learn anything? And then the other interesting experiment to do is, if you do have zones based off of any of these tests, is to just compare them to what are your threshold tests off of a threshold, field test, or max heart rate, or your threshold heart rate, or the maffetone thing, 180 minus your age.
Right.
It's pretty surprising how often that works pretty much well enough. It's a tough one. So.
Right.
So.
Okay. Well, if you have any more specific questions around testing and, when to do it, how to do it, why to do it, definitely hit us up, consummateathlete.com, or on Instagram at consummateathlete. Really kind of enjoy these very nuanced questions. As everyone knows, whenever I interview someone, I love the answer, it depends. So very fun. Also, I feel like if you're watching this on YouTube, I feel like I look like I'm like an evil like villain type person because DW has joined the podcast and he's like sitting on my lap. So I feel like I'm just like sitting here like stroking this little dachshund.
Yeah. Are we going to do the second question?
I think let's do the second question.
I do think it's related to this one, but before we do that one, there is like all these wearables coming. There are like some of these breathing rate measurements that are coming. It's often like built into almost like a heart rate strap, but there's a few different ways this can work. And I think those might be really interesting for this like talk test thing, because it actually is showing you your breathing rate. And so you can see if it's increasing and, what's a steady state. So I just want to mention that as that's sort of an interesting thing that's coming when we're talking about testing and, wearables and, zone 2 and all this other stuff.
Yeah, I think maybe the last thing, now that you mentioned that, there is no end to the amount of testing, wearables, apps, like et cetera, that you can buy to calculate things regarding your training, but none of them are actually training. So just bearing in mind that
and everything in physiology is this big spectrum that shifts depending on, again, all these different factors, right? So it is tricky. And I do think, that getting out there and doing it,
yeah, just be careful that you're not spending your free training hours trying to decide which test or wearable or whatever you're going to do next.
Right. And I think, again, we'll get to the question that we're going to cover here, the second one, but a lot of these things, I do like that, well, do most people do this? And have people been successful without doing it is sort of interesting, right? So it's always sort of coming back that like it might seem that like one person on Instagram is doing this, but there's probably a lot of people who don't do it regularly. And again, this is the thing is like, are they actually using it to make any decisions, or indeed are they just doing it and then guessing like the rest of us for the rest of the year or the rest of their career? It's hard to say. So we talked about metabolic testing zone 2. So this is the aerobic threshold.
This
So
is conversational pace.
right. So this is what we're beating around this. So there's sort of the three values, if you will, right? If we keep on this testing thing. So this is the aerobic threshold. So this is where you go from easy training into moderate training. Okay. And then there's the lactate threshold or the anaerobic threshold or the ventilatory threshold or the functional threshold per hour. None of them are the same, but they're all sort of hinting at when we go from moderate to hard or severe or difficult, right? So if we think about a 3-zone system, there'd be easy. In the middle between those two thresholds, there'd be moderate. So this is where your tempo and your sweet spot and your threshold training zones are. And then above that is what you might call anaerobic or really hard or sprinting or VO2 or these other things that are up above the thresholds, the anaerobic thresholds, the functional thresholds. Okay. So a little confusing, but there's sort of those three values. And it's interesting to think about training just in that way, is that we have these three values or types of intensities, if you will, and we can sort of, they move a little bit independent of each other. They're not at a set value. And so if you think about your track sprinters might have this huge sprint capacity, cyclocross racers, maybe like really high lactate threshold or maybe really high VO2. I don't, it could go either way, I guess. And then, but then your Ironman triathletes on the other spectrum, they might have this really high aerobic threshold or zone 2 that might be really, really high, but they might have very little sprints. There might be, they might be really tight. Those thresholds might be really tight together, if that makes sense, right? If you can think about them. Sometimes we talk about ceilings and, a house where you're raising the levels of the different ceilings and the floors. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I still just like easy, moderate, hard. But
Yeah.
okay.
Well, and that's probably the 3-zone system is probably the best way to think about it, where there's easy, moderate, hard. Moderate is between these two thresholds, aerobic and anaerobic. Let's just use those terms because people generally know them. So the idea then is my training, my endurance training, my zone 2 training, is it ruined? This is the question. Is it ruined if I go into the moderate or severe, zones? If I go too hard, if I surge, if I go a sprint, if I do an interval, has it ruined all the zone 2 adaptations that I was going to get from my zone 2 endurance training?
Right.
So you're out on your run and there's a little hill and you continue to run up it and you breathe really hard. You can't pass the talk test. May as well go home.
Just, I mean, not even go home, just lay down on the trail.
Yeah.
It's just over.
Well, your life's over.
Yeah. Yeah. Just the bears can come for me.
So again, I think some of this came from Dr. Inigo, who was on Peter T and a few other things and talked about.
To be clear, we love.
Yes. Talked about when you do surge like that, what that means, as per the testing conversation, is the lactate might increase. You develop a bit more lactate because you're working harder. You don't pass the talk test. Your breathing gets a little more labored. So you develop a bit of lactate, which isn't bad. It's a fuel. It just means you went a little more, quote unquote, anaerobic. You went a little harder. So then the idea is that some of the gains, because now we have this other fuel, then we're not burning fat and so then the mitochondrial adaptations and all these stimulus apparently might be on hold for 30 minutes or so after this surge. And that may be true, but that doesn't mean that, you've lost everything or that workout doesn't have benefit where it is, or that there's a whole other set of adaptations that might happen because of that surge or those lactates that are in the system. It's not clear that that's bad, but it might be slightly different. But I think what we're come back to is that people have been exercising for a long time and doing time sprints and doing intervals at different times during the workout. So I think we need to come back to that. Like, it probably isn't the end of the world because we're all still here and we're all still training. And probably all of us, have to get up a hill and don't have the, fitness to get up the hill without going out of zone 2.
Right. And I mean, certainly if you're an off-road athlete, I mean, unless you're, as we were briefly training in Florida where it's pancake flat, like there's always going to be at least small climbs. Like even the flattest route that I can find, like on the trail at home is going to have those hills. Like
Sure.
that's just part of it. And I mean, it's also, I mean, I recognize the importance of doing the zone two training, but at some point you're like any race is going to have
It's true.
ups and downs.
And so I think what we're trying to avoid, there's this whole spectrum again of if you're not actually ever in zone two, which is usually what I see is, okay, well, this just was not at all an endurance ride. You were going very hard a lot of the time. Maybe you're trying to keep up with a group ride. And so what you'll see is people are in that middle ground intensity a lot of the ride, and then they'll call it a zone two or an endurance workout. So that's not the
That's the
same.
problem. Yeah.
And what we're looking for is lots of time in that endurance range, and then other days that are either moderate or hard in their focus. And those days that are moderate or hard in their focus, I think, do whatever you need to do. Some people will say, you do a bit of endurance training zone two, and then towards the end of the workout, that's something that, again, Dr. Inigo has popularized here a little bit in the last year or so, where you sort of get the benefit of your endurance training and then do the glycolytic or the anaerobic or the hard or, whatever intervals later in the workout. But I mean, people have been doing, warm up intervals, cool down forever. And I think you probably want two of those because there are other benefits, especially when we start thinking towards performance and racing, riding off-road for fun, these sort of things. Like, it's just going to be that way. There isn't really a way around it. That's sort of the way to do it. So I think what you're looking for is this intensity discipline, which is something Tim Cusack, you mentioned earlier in the podcast, talks about a lot, where some days are flatter and at your own endurance pace, and then other days are more spirited, interval training, group rides, races, whatever, and you get that good mix in the week.
Right. Now with your clients, or I mean just in general, would you say in the endurance thing, are you better to try to stay in I think most people are probably better served trying to stay in the lower end of it versus kind of creeping into that turning
Of the endurance zone.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, some
'Cause I think
people, gets to the beginner. I think you just need to get out the door and do it. I don't think you need
right.
to stress over it, because when Dr. Inigo's talking, he's often speaking towards, I think a little bit, these people who are doing it for health get on their, Peloton or whatever, and they pedal at zone two, that's very controllable, and it just takes a bit of discipline. So I agree with that. If you're doing it for health, a few times a week, doing 45 to an hour of zone two is probably good. And that's very controllable. For the people who are trying to get out and ride and race, it's just hard because you can't control it when your threshold is very low. Your fitness is relatively low, right? You don't have a lot of watts, right? Whereas people in the pro tour can probably go up to, say, even 300 watts, and still be in their zone two.
And
So
that's actually what Dr. Sam Milan pointed out when I was interviewing him about zone two. He's, Pogacar can do that, climbing Alpe d'Huez.
he can do any route in the world and just use his gears a little bit and he'll be fine.
Yeah, exactly. So slightly more nuanced for the rest of us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's where the more zones and a little more of that discipline, or, the specific intensity they're doing makes sense. Whereas for a lot of other people, it's sort of, what is the focus for today? Get out the door. Is this an easy ride or a moderate ride? Try and pick your routes accordingly is important. When you don't have a lot of watts, if you can't make it up the hill, without going over, then I think that makes sense to try and pick your routes and plan your days accordingly. And that I think will be beneficial. And then you'll have more energy and better recovery for those hard days. And those would be the days you go and do the hilly route. You do the mountain bike, the off-road workout that's going to require, that there's just no way to do it off-road. Right. And the other side, sometimes I think the bigger question is, when we're doing endurance, you want to keep your legs moving. I think this is sometimes missed. You don't want to sprint and you don't want to coast. So this is the idea, is that you try and ride really steady. And so this is also where the route becomes a bit more important. And that's probably a bigger focus for a lot of people, is just keep your legs moving, no coasting, try not to soft pedal. And that usually gets rid of some of that, I'm surging up every hill. If you can't coast, you have to keep pedaling on the way down. A lot of people, that'll smooth it out over time too. And then you'll start seeing, fitness should start improving as well from that. But I think that's probably a better way to think about it. A bit of the talk test, but then no sprinting, no coasting, and away you go.
And don't panic if you go a little bit hard up a hill.
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's a huge deal, but I do think, it's possible that those exact, gains might be different, but it's not to say that you're not gaining fitness or gaining benefit from
Right.
the workout by surging. There's certainly other things that happen, and again, this is where we get so spun up about one thing in the body and we forget that there's all sorts of things in the body. If we start thinking too much about lactate, then you forget that there's all these other mechanisms and things going on, especially when you start thinking about a chaotic thing like a mountain bike race, right? How many different ways do you lose a mountain bike race, right? You crash into the tree. It didn't really matter what your threshold was.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I think Tim Cusack said that like 10 times when I was talking to him last week for a different article, just like the body is a complex system. The body's a complex system. Okay, last question on that before we wrap up. The heart rate versus the power zones. In theory, they line up perfectly, right? Like that's on paper. That's
Yeah.
what they should
Yeah.
do.
No, they try and do the same number of zones and everything else. Sure. Yeah.
But so in this like staying in zone 2 thing, which one are we focusing on? Or I mean, does it count as over if the power hasn't gone over the zone, but the heart rate has, or vice
Sure.
versa?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a good question. It's hard. I don't know. I don't know. It depends who count. I don't think it really matters that much. Again, I think what you're looking for probably is that you're not sprinting, you're not coasting. So the heart rate's staying more in that zone. The power is staying more in that zone. The averages would be in that zone. If the average is at the top of the zone, that usually means that you spent a significant amount of time above the zone, right? So if your top of zone 2 is 140 beats per minute and the average is 140 beats per minute, then probably, either you were pegged right on that or you spent a lot of time at, 150 and 145.
Right.
So I think that's probably the bigger thing is that, how much time are you out of that? How many minutes did you accumulate in that zone? And a lot of the software, Training Peaks and so forth, will give you buckets that you spent for power and heart rate in those zones. It'll also tell you how long you were coasting, the bucket for the zero cadence. So you can start tracking these types of things. I think that's the bigger idea.
Well, and I think definitely just keeping an eye on, are the zones consistently lining up? Like, from like
Approximately, yeah.
like it's one thing if like one ride your heart rate is like a little more elevated.
Well,
There's so many, again, complex system, lots of factors.
Yeah.
You're a little hungover, you're a little fatigued, whatever.
You're at altitude or it's the first hot
Sure.
day, you're getting tired.
Yeah. But I think if that consistently is happening, like every ride, you're, trying to stay at that endurance
Mhm.
power, but your heart rate is going over the endurance heart rate zone, it's time to reassess where that power is.
Right. So, and there's three things, and I think it's worth using all three things. So the feeling, the heart rate, the power, because you're right. There's going to be all sorts of variables. We've been training for a while here, a bit of a base block, and I tend to be someone whose heart rate starts getting depressed as I get more volume in me. So I can start riding. The other day I was even mountain biking, and it was like 117 beats, or I think was my average, which is getting towards like that's like the bottom of say like a zone 2, like it's getting to zone 1, which is fine because we're doing lots of volume. But it was hard to push my heart rate up, but then the power is actually solid, right? Like I think it's good to normal power. And then the feeling was actually a little tired feeling, which often you'll see the depressed heart rate with a bit of tired feeling, right? But the power actually is okay. So this is where you need to be careful, because if you keep persisting like that, then that can become overtraining and lots of fatigue. So again, this is where you can start being like, okay, well, what would I do the next day? Well, probably you need to recover. You probably wouldn't try a hard workout. You probably wouldn't want to be mountain biking that next day. It might be either an off day or a flat recovery day or something like that, where you try and get that muscular fatigue or whatever's causing that depression, right? So I think there's a lot of testing that can come out of this training if you pay attention to these different things. And there's a reason we don't want them to line up, right? Or else why would you, this is what Marco always says, like if your HRV just matched your training load or something like this, like why would you even capture these things, right? It doesn't make sense. That's not what you want. You want these things to be actually a little different so that you can start seeing these different trends, right? And see things changing over time.
Well, and your ideal, I guess, is that your power is going up, but your heart rate is actually staying lower in that zone, right?
Or normal. Yeah. So your heart rate might be the same, but you're pushing more power.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. So if you were still in your heart rate zone, the power starts creeping up and up, again, assuming that would be an example again, where in what I just gave you, that where I could have kept my heart rate in the the heart rate zone for endurance, but I would have probably been like pushing towards threshold power for a while at least, right? With a very high feeling or perceived exertion. And so you'd want to be careful because that wasn't the idea, to be pushing that much power and that type of feeling on that day, right? And I do think that's where feeling and breathing and things like that, muscle tension, that almost should guide a lot of it, right? And usually they line up pretty well, but that's where you might end up lower in a zone because the feeling is just to be at the top of that zone is a little harder. Yeah. So I would say if you wanted your quote for an article, a takeaway, I would say heart rate usually is how I would guide that. But there are lots of situations where it gets trickier. So it is nice to have 2 or 3 of those other things to triangulate.
All right, perfect. Well, let's wrap up there. As always, again, more questions, consummateathlete.com, at consummateathlete on Instagram. And also, if you are enjoying this podcast, do us a huge favor. Please rate, review, subscribe. The review is super easy to do. It's really, really, really helpful for us. We greatly appreciate it. If you're not sure how to do it, over on Instagram and actually on our website, we do have like a quick tutorial on how to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. I know it can be like a little bit confusing, but yeah, appreciate that very much. With that, have a great week, and we will see you next Tuesday. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Consummate Athlete podcast. If you want to hear more training, racing, and endurance sport advice, make sure you subscribe to the podcast and leave us a rating and review. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at consummateathlete.com for a weekly dose of inspiration and advice straight to your inbox.